My dad always told me stories about fleeing a war-torn country, about how we were refugees searching for a safe home. I believed every word. I grew up listening to him say that we had nothing but each other, that our past was buried in fear and chaos. But last summer, curious about my family roots, I signed up for a DNA testing kit. I thought it would just tell me about distant relatives or my ethnic background. I never imagined it would unravel everything I believed about my father. When the results came, I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. One match caught my eye: a man in Europe listed on an international crime database, wanted for embezzling millions of euros. My heart skipped. There was no doubt, the DNA was an exact match to my dad. The reality slammed into me harder than any lie he could tell. My dad wasn't just hiding minor secrets. He had been hiding a criminal past, a life that had nothing to do with war or being a refugee. I couldn't breathe. For 30 years, the man I loved as my father had lived a lie, constructing a whole identity to escape the law. Before I could process, I had to tell someone. This story needed to be shared. If you're watching, make sure to like, comment, share and subscribe, because this story is just getting started. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He sat across from me in the living room, quiet and composed, as if waiting for this day. "Alan," he said softly, "I was never a refugee." Every word he spoke felt like a punch. He explained how he had been involved in a massive embezzlement scheme at a European bank when he was young, how the law was after him, and how he fled under a new identity to save his family, including me, from the fallout. I couldn't reconcile the man I had known with the one in front of me, the man whose name wasn't even his real name. My dad's calmness only made it worse. I expected anger, guilt, tears. But he had built this life meticulously, covering every trace of his past. I thought of the neighborhood we grew up in, of the friends who believed his stories, and of the vacations we took that were supposedly freedom trips from a war-torn past. Every memory became questionable. How much of my life was based on lies? As I absorbed his words, I knew this was a story that needed to be shared widely. Like, comment, share, and subscribe if you want to see how deep this goes. I spent nights combing through online records, newspaper archives, and court documents, piecing together the man my father had really been. I learned about the embezzlement, millions siphoned from unsuspecting investors, a scandal that shook the bank, and a sudden disappearance that left Europe searching. The timeline matched perfectly with my dad's disappearance from his home country. The more I dug, the more I realized he hadn't just run, he had planned everything. He had assumed a new identity, claimed refugee status, and integrated seamlessly into a community that had no reason to suspect him. Even his friends and neighbors had been fooled. I felt both awe and fear. He was brilliant, but the consequences of his actions were catastrophic. How many lives had been affected? And what did that make me? A daughter unknowingly connected to a criminal past? My head spun. Every detail, every memory of him telling me stories about hardship now carried a hidden weight. I needed to document everything. And now I'm telling you this story. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe so others understand the shocking truth I discovered. A week later, I confronted him again, armed with the evidence I had gathered. His face was unreadable as I laid out the documents on the dining table, photos, bank reports, and news articles from 30 years ago. I watched his hands tighten around the edge of the table, but he said nothing at first. Then he sighed and admitted that the DNA evidence would eventually reveal him. He claimed that he had only ever wanted to give me and my mother a safe life. His words sounded rehearsed, like a speech from someone who had practiced every line for decades. I struggled to process his justifications. I wanted to hate him, to scream at the lies and manipulation. But there was also a part of me that understood why he did it, though that understanding didn't erase the betrayal. He had lived 2 lives, and now the truth was here, undeniable. I felt like the walls of my world had collapsed. Everything I thought I knew about my father, my family, and our past had been an illusion. I turned to my computer and began typing this story, hoping to reach people who could appreciate the complexity of living with a secret. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to follow this journey with me. I tried talking to my mother about it, but she shut down. "We can't undo the past," she said, her voice trembling. She refused to speak about Europe or the crimes, insisting that the only thing that mattered was the life they had built here. I felt torn. I wanted to understand fully, but the more I asked, the more walls went up. I realized that this lie had been a family shield, a story that kept us safe while hiding danger. I spent days reflecting on my own identity. Who was I if the foundation of my life was built on someone else's deception? And yet, I also recognized the life my father had provided, a warm home, education, love, and care. The moral ambiguity was suffocating. Could I reconcile the man who raised me with the criminal he had once been? I felt the weight of the truth pressing down. And I knew this story had to reach more than just my family circle. I turned to my camera and said to myself, people need to hear this. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to witness the truth unravel. The next step was contacting authorities. I didn't know if I should turn him in or keep his secret to protect my own life. I wrestled with fear, confusion, and guilt. Reporting him meant facing the reality that my entire childhood was a lie. But keeping it secret felt like complicity. I decided to reach out to the European Crime Bureau anonymously, sending them the DNA match and all the evidence I had collected. The waiting period was unbearable. Every knock at the door made my heart race. I wondered if my father suspected, if he knew I was moving so close to exposing him. Weeks passed, and there was still no response. The tension at home was thick. He was more distant, quieter, and I could see the calculation behind his calm eyes. I realized that this story, my story, was bigger than my fear. It was a tale of truth confronting deception. And now, I wanted the world to know, like, comment, share, and subscribe to follow the rest of this unbelievable journey. As the investigation unfolded, I learned that my father's life in Europe had been more extensive than I imagined. He had allies, people who had helped him escape, who had maintained his secret network. The embezzlement case had left a wake of destruction, ruined careers, and bankrupt families. And yet, he had eluded capture for decades. Every file I read, every witness account I studied, made me realize the brilliance and danger of the man I called my father. I was in awe and horror simultaneously. Could someone who cared so much for me also be capable of such calculated crime? The duality was staggering. I documented every detail for myself, hoping someday to make sense of it. But sharing it felt urgent. I filmed my reflections, my disbelief, my heartbreak. And I reminded everyone watching, like, comment, share, and subscribe, because this story is far from over. The more I learned, the more I understood how carefully he had constructed his life. The refugee story wasn't just a lie, it was a shield, a convincing narrative that allowed him to live among us unnoticed. He had changed his accent, adjusted his mannerisms, and even planted memories with neighbors and friends to support the story. It was a masterclass in deception. And yet, he had made a daughter who loved him unconditionally. I felt trapped in conflicting emotions, admiration for his cunning, horror at the crimes, and grief for the loss of truth. I wrote down everything in chronological order, piecing together the decades he had hidden from the world. Each revelation hit me harder than the last. I realized the story had viral potential because it was unbelievable yet real. Someone could escape a criminal past for 30 years, and only DNA could expose them. If you're watching, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to follow the twists that come next. I confronted him one last time, this time not with evidence, but with emotion. Why? I asked, my voice shaking. Why risk everything for us? He looked at me, tired, resigned, and said simply, because I couldn't bear for you to suffer for my sins. His answer was not satisfactory. It was infuriating and heartbreaking. I wanted more, accountability, remorse, anything. But he offered only truth and silence. I understood in that moment that some questions would remain unanswered. Life would continue with a mixture of love and mistrust, truth and deception. But sharing this story with the world felt necessary, to show that reality can be stranger than fiction, and that even the people we trust most can harbor unthinkable secrets. And again, like, comment, share, and subscribe, because this story is only partially told. The world eventually learned about his past through the investigation, though my identity was kept private. Media outlets ran the story, fascinated by the decades-long evasion. I watched from a distance, feeling a strange combination of vindication and shame. People commented, debated, and shared the narrative, shocked that a man could live a double life for so long. I reflected on how personal truth and public revelation collided in my life. I still struggled with trust, with reconciling the father I knew and the criminal history I uncovered. But there was one thing I understood: stories, even painful ones, need to be told. I documented everything in videos, hoping that others could learn about courage, betrayal, and the fragility of trust. And as always, I reminded my viewers: like, comment, share, and subscribe, because the story of my father and my family is a story you won't forget. Life went on slowly. I built my own identity, separate from the shadows of my father's past. I focused on education, relationships, and finding stability. Yet, sometimes, I caught myself reflecting on his brilliance and cunning, on the decades he spent hiding from the world. And I realized that stories like mine resonate because they reveal the complexity of human choices, the gray between right and wrong. Sharing this story was my way of processing, of making sense of lies and love entwined. And if you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to witness more stories that challenge your perception of truth, family, and identity.